the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest Downtown podcast. We are Frankless, I'm afraid. He's gone off to the very important conference in Nippon, and despite his super technology, it hasn't worked, so he's not with us. But we still have the wonderful Jo Phillips, former comms officer and aide to Paddy Ashdown, the Lib Dem leader, and also a regular appearer on GB News, where she'll be on tomorrow night with Nigel Farage. And if there's anything that's called compulsive viewing this week, that's going to be it, because Mr. Farage, as we all know, has a little local difficulty. And we'll be coming on to that in the second part of the programme. But we're going to begin today with a in-depth look at the incredibly turbulent and ever-developing international situation. What's been happening over the last week. Is there a credible deal for peace that the Ukrainian leader could possibly accept? What is Donald Trump up to? I've heard all sorts of really outlandish global suggestions over the last week, which I want to share with Jo. So let's start off, Jo, with your take on, do a summary of what's happened in the last week and what you think are the most significant developments.
Well, we all know that famous phrase, a week is a long time in politics, but blimey, since we last spoke last Monday with Frank, so much has happened, it's almost impossible to keep track. You almost need your own correspondent keeping track of Trump, who goes from one side to another. He's absolutely, ranting and raving 1 minute and then trying to be all sweetness and light the next. I mean, the real big thing, Jim, of course, is the plight of Ukraine, who have had American aid cut off. They're desperately trying to get support and retain support from Europe and other partners and friends across the world. But meantime, their ability to fight has been severely curtailed because America is not sharing intelligence with them. And although Elon Musk said this morning that he wasn't going to cut the satellite links, I wouldn't trust him as far as I could see, frankly. And I think it's very, very grim. And in the meantime, we've got, Poland bringing in a sort of semi-national service, if you like, to ramp up military capability. And from what we're hearing, and this could all change in a couple of hours, while talks are supposed to be starting in Saudi Arabia today, the general consensus from America is that Ukraine will have to cede quite a lot of territory to Russia, not just what it's already got, which is Crimea and the Donetsk region. But Alex Graham, the former head of MI5, was talking on the radio earlier. We don't even know whether there will be a Ukraine. What is the deal at the moment? It looks like a deal for America to go in and speculatively start mining these rare earth minerals, which aren't that rare. But in the meantime, there doesn't seem to be any movement at all from Putin.
But do you actually think that Vladimir Zelensky would possibly sign a deal that just involved that and didn't involve any guarantees about what would happen in the future with Russia? I mean, I don't think he could sign that. He'd have to resign. But I mean, of course, we'll come on to the implications of his resignation. But I mean, it's inconceivable that he could just sign a deal which says ceasefire line, no British or American or any other troops to police that ceasefire line. America would pile in and try and get these minerals, which incidentally I'm hearing increasingly is not a done deal. The actual geology is not that clear, which has further implications, which could mean that the Americans go and look for these rare metals, or whoever they employ from Indonesia and the Philippines and other Bangladesh to actually do the mining. But that's another story. And pull out, and then you've got no guarantee about what Russia will do. And this sort of idea that because American mining engineers were all over Western Ukraine, therefore the Russians wouldn't attack, even that would evaporate. I mean, I just don't see that Zelensky can sign that, and he must be hoping that Starmer and Macron's attempts to try and get the United States at least to be a backstop would be the only thing he could accept.
Well, that's what, sensible people would think, Jim, but we're not dealing with sensible people. I mean, Zelensky is absolutely caught between a rock and a hard place. We've seen just in the last few days increased Russian activity. No suggestion that they're even pausing whilst these talks look. They're making it very clear that all the time Ukraine's trying to fight with one hand tied behind its back because its lack of access to military equipment, which is sitting on the Polish border, a lot of it, all this stuff which the Americans had given and then Trump stopped, it's sitting on the border. They can't use it. They're not able to access intelligence material and information. So, how long can he go on holding out when Russia clearly at the moment has got the upper hand thanks to Trump, who's certainly rooting for Putin. And I just wonder what he could do. And of course, as you say, Jim, I mean, if he said, I'm not signing this, I'm resigning, well, Putin and Trump will be rubbing their hands in glee and they'll put in a Russian sympathizer. And then, if you were in Poland, you'd be terribly frightened, I think.
Right. Well, what you've just said has huge implications because you are suggesting that actually in those circumstances, the United States would collude with the Russians to try and impose a Russian puppet to govern Ukraine. You think Trump's gone that far down the road, do you?
Trump's office has reportedly already had conversations with the two people who were the opponents to Zelensky when he was elected president back in whenever it was. And both of those people have said, no, we're not having elections. There's a war on. We'll deal with this after the war is over. I think Trump will do whatever is best for him. It's not about whether it's best for America or best for Europe or best for NATO. It's what he's going to make money out of. He, as I've said before, Jim, I think he sees the world as a monopoly board and he's playing Monopoly with Putin. And this is about divvying it up and making money. But this whole rare earths thing, A, they're not rare. B, there's no guarantee that there's as much there as people think. And it could take up to 18 years before you can get it out of the ground. And the figures that Trump is actually talking about, according to many very expert people in the field of mining, in the field of rare earth minerals, and in the field of the finance of this, say the figures he's talking about from Ukraine are about 10 times the entire global value of them. So, again, he's talking utter nonsense.
Well, that brings us to whether, in the with this malign project that the United States are embarked on, if we accept what you say, the only way of thwarting that would be for this coalition of the willing, which we understand Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron are trying to put together, that they could do a deal. But I suppose the difficulty would be that there's absolutely no chance of Putin negotiating with Macron and Starmer without the United States being involved. I mean, if we went to Putin and said, we are now with the Ukrainians and we want to negotiate peace, is there a remotest chance that Putin will say, well, where's the United States in all this? And we could say, well, no, they're not involved in that. I mean, is there any prospect of that sort of alternative scenario?
I don't see it, Jim, and I'm sure there are many, many back channels going on and many, many conversations, and the extremely sensible, capable, and historically successful Jonathan Powell, who is Keir Starmer's security boss, who was hugely instrumental in brokering the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, will be involved with this, as will Peter Mandelson, as will be similar people from European countries. The problem is that I think it's about timing. Yes, there might be possible to pull together a coalition of the willing. Yes, it might be possible to pull together a sort of a European army, if you like, even if it is one that is not going into war, not going into combat, but is there to maintain borders and security. But as I just said, I mean, as we've seen Russia ramp up its attacks over the weekend, every day that goes past is more ground given to Russia, more casualties and deaths to both sides, but particularly Ukraine. And I don't know how much time there is before this gets so much worse. I mean, it's escalated so much in the last few days. It almost doesn't bear thinking about. And I just feel for the people of Ukraine who have fought so bravely. I mean, I don't know quite whether because the other thing, of course, is NATO. If Ukraine could join NATO, which we promised them they could, or it would be considered, decades ago, can they do that if the US blocks it? I mean, the Americans voted with North Korea and Belarus, for goodness sake.
No, I regret to say that I don't think Ukraine's membership of NATO is even worth discussing at the moment. I mean, you're raising the thought in my head now that without this surveillance provided by the United States and the absolutely, as you say, you'd have thought that if the Russians do want even a ceasefire on their own terms, that they would have not stepped up their military activity at this time. And the fact that they have, raises the prospect, does it, of a military collapse by Ukraine, and therefore all this discussion about a ceasefire will become irrelevant as the Russians advance on Kyiv once again.
Well, exactly. And, that's what's so chilling, I think, that, all the time these talks are going on, all the time this effort is going on, whatever you think about Trump, which in my case is not very much, but he has got things moving. And all of that activity is going on in Europe and in the UK and in America and elsewhere. But Russia could have just gone, okay, let's just ease back a little bit, see what happens, give everybody a break. But they've gone in all guns blazing, literally, which I think shows that they've got no interest in peace.
Let's look at one or two other major issues that have arisen in the last week. And the first one is, and I put it to you quite straightforwardly, can we trust the United States with it's not inconsiderable, our military intelligence anymore? Or is there a real prospect that if it suited Trump, he would share military intelligence that we've garnered in relation to the Ukrainian conflict with Russia?
Well, I don't think we can. And I'm sure people who are within the security world will have been having those conversations. I mean, the fact that America has ceased monitoring the sort of cybersecurity of Russia, the fact that they clearly are sharing information and are having these back channel chats with people, and the fact that they look as though they are willing to lift sanctions on Russia, go back to doing business with Russia. There's even talk of diplomats being able to return to America. They are moving, the phrase of the last few weeks, there's always one, isn't there, is at pace. But they are moving at pace to welcome Russia back into the fold, if you like. And I think with the questions raised over Tulsi Gabbard, who's the head of American security intelligence, who was by many people, named as or suggested that she was a Russian asset. I don't think we can trust them. And that, given that with Five Eyes, as we talked about a little bit last week, everything is shared in real time. It's very, very concerning. But, what do? You say we're not going to share with America because we don't trust them anymore. But I don't think anybody could trust them.
And what is the long-term game here? I've heard it suggested that what Trump is up to is to try and break up the Russian-Chinese alliance by making Russia so grateful for the way in which Trump has completely upturned Europe and weakened it and gets the more admiration from Putin, that Putin will be susceptible to sort of working with the United States and pulling Russia away from China, so that the ultimate thing, which to be fair was started under Obama, this pivot from Europe to Asia because of the Chinese threat, that the Americans are trying to get Russia on their side so that they can isolate China. I mean, I don't see any evidence at all or motivation for Russia breaking up its alliance with China. And it will just say to Putin, thank you, to Trump, thank you very much indeed for what you've done with Ukraine, but we're not breaking with our Chinese allies.
Well, two things. One is I don't think Trump is that strategic. I think he's impulsive and it's what he wants. I mean, this is a man who's apparently said he was very disappointed to see President Zelensky with with the King Charles at Sandringham last week because it, and I quote, doesn't make him feel special anymore. Well, Jim, you and I have both got grandchildren and they sort of stop saying that when they're about 5 years old. This is a 78-year-old man who's supposed to be the leader of the free world, behaving like a toddler. And I should imagine that Putin is probably sitting there laughing his head off at this fool who is doing his work for him. There is nothing in this. Putin will probably get a chunk of Ukraine, if not more. But Trump's only looking at, today, tomorrow, the headlines. He's not looking strategically further down the road.
No, well, is he looking at the American economy statistics? Because they're not looking quite so good for him, are they?
No, they're not. And the big thing apparently is the price of eggs. Who thought? I mean, I know Frank will be laughing from his luxury hotel in Cannes or wherever he is, because he'll think, oh God, they're going down the road of bright headlights. Now they're talking about the price of eggs. But the price of eggs apparently in America is terrible. And it all comes back to it's the economy, stupid. Now, yes, he's getting headlines and people think he's strong and they think he's great. But a lot of people in America, the polling over the weekend showed they didn't like the way he treated Zelensky in the White House. There's quite a lot of people falling out of love with Musk because they think he's got too much power and he wasn't elected. They don't like J.D. Vance. I mean, of course, there are the ardent loyalists. But you're now beginning to see the impact of all this slash and burn or chainsaw massacre. So you are actually beginning to see it trickle down into people's real lives. That veterans, for instance, can't get their benefits. We've got, mad anti-vaccine Robert F. Kennedy Jr. telling people, take cod liver oil for measles. There's a massive outbreak of measles in Texas.
Or perhaps disinfectant. That was a solution from Dr. Trump last time.
And then you've got things like bird flu, which is spreading very rapidly in America and is now jumped to cattle. So you're seeing all of those things, and they've effectively closed down all the agencies that monitor infectious diseases, problems with agriculture and crops, all of those things, plus a whole load of the works of civic institutions that keep people paid in houses, in schools. I mean, they're stopping funding to so many things, and they are banning scientists from traveling abroad, and they're closing down research. They're closing down pretty much their own security and intelligence operation.
But to try and be fair about this, apparently they have closed the Mexican border to immigrants.
Yeah. So.
And that's an important one on the other side of the scales. It's not something the British government have been able to do with the Channel.
Well, yeah. No, I agree. I mean, then there are some things that people will go now, particularly after Joe Biden, who probably would have let the war in Ukraine rumble on because it's easier to just keep giving money rather than try and there are a lot of things that you can say, no, what Trump has done is shaken things up. He's reunited Europe in a way that none of us ever thought possible. He's shaken things up around the world. He's created a resurgence of the Liberal Party in Canada, who are really fighting back. But, he only needs some catastrophe at home, whether it's a disease outbreak or something like that, or a major economic problem. And the tariff things, then he had to row back on the tariffs, realizing that it was actually going to really hit American car makers because of the tariffs between Canada and America. So, there's all of this stuff, but we have often spoken in the context of our own economy and the Chancellor about how businesses, above all, need certainty. They are not getting certainty from Trump. And that will have a huge impact on investment, on recruitment, on retention, and also people looking to invest in American companies.
Yeah, you mentioned Canada. I mean, the latest position is, I mean, the 25% tariffs were put on, and now the very latest thing is that they were taken off again. And now we've got Carney as the new leader of Canada. I mean, what's your assessment of all that? I mean, do you think Trump is going to try and negotiate with Carney and then might decide not to impose the tariffs after all?
Well, he's only given them a month, same as Mexico. He gave them a month's grace, if you like. Don't know. I mean, I don't know that much about Canadian politics. All I know is that the Liberals were on their knees. That's Justin Trudeau's party. He made a very emotional farewell speech last night. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, was elected prime minister. Now, the strangeness of the Canadian political system means that he can be elected prime minister even though he doesn't have a parliamentary seat. And there is some speculation that what he might do is call a snap election because they're doing very well in the polls.
Is he not a member of the Canadian Parliament?
No, and you don't have to be. But he could then find himself a seat, call a snap election, so he would then be in Parliament, and then would in effect be the leader. And there's a lot of sense in that because they are doing well. They're fighting back against Trump. They've got this phrase that Trudeau used, elbows up, which apparently is an ice hockey thing, to fight your corner, fight your space. And I think, there's an awful lot going on in an awful lot of places. And a lot of it is uniting people against America in a way that I never thought I would see in my lifetime.
Yes. Well, and there's a lot going on in what's called the High North, meaning the Arctic area, not only with Canada, but also in Greenland. There are elections this Tuesday. I can't imagine that ever before has the world looked at the Greenland elections with any interest. I'm not sure. I imagine that all parties in the 60,000 electorate, I mean, the electorate is less than an English constituency. It's just wonderful. Oh, but I imagine they're all united in opposing any idea of being taken over by the Trump empire. But obviously, the importance of this is in relation to NATO as well, because, the high north now, with global warming, sea lanes are opening. Again, minerals are becoming available. And if you look at the Earth from the top, you actually see how close together Russia and the United States and Europe are.
Well, exactly. And, as I've said before, it's 55 miles between Alaska and America and Russia.
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent summary from you about the world situation. When we come back after the break, we'll turn to the domestic implications of all this. Sir Keir Starmer certainly seems to have done himself no harm in relation to all these matters. But obviously, with the defence expenditure looming up, that has huge implications for the spring statement. We'll be discussing all that and the little local difficulty facing Reform UK. Welcome back, everybody. And I should have said at the beginning, just before we move on, that what a wonderful time I had at this event in Liverpool on Friday. We were celebrating some wonderful achievements by women in the Merseyside area for downtown. It was a wonderful lunch, a joyous occasion, hosted by my dear friend and longtime television presenter colleague Lucy Meacock. A truly wonderful event, and just the popularity of downtown events is just fantastic, and that was another one of those. But now we're going to turn to the domestic situation. I think we should begin by carrying on our theme of Ukraine, because it is impacting on British domestic politics. I mean, first of all, Joe, Sir Keir Starmer, as we have frequently said on this podcast, has had a less than auspicious start to his premiership, but his very solidity and calm seems to have cometh the hour, cometh the man. in terms of his world status as someone who's trying to do this dreadfully difficult thing of trying to keep on board this highly volatile United States president, along with the Irwis complex, attempts to try and get the European allies together for some sort of coherent military response to the looming threat in Ukraine. But Sir Keir does seem to have raised his game and got some advantage in the polls from it.
Yes, he's got a certain bounce in the polls, and I think he has. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because it's always difficult when you first take over as Prime Minister, and there are lots of dates in the diary abroad, and that's what he was doing. I mean, for the first few weeks, he was barely in London. He was hither and yon, and you sort of wondered what was going on. Well, we know what was going on, not very much. But he has really come into his own, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, do you remember, 2008 financial crash? Gordon Brown pulled together, the sort of the financial world and basically saved the economy. We'll probably never get the credit he deserves for that. And in a sense, that's what Starmer has done. And he is that all those things that are the downside in many ways are actually the plus for this, the calmness, the taking time. He didn't go on social media after the terrible appearance of Zelensky in the White House. He phoned Zelensky, he phoned Trump. I think, and I know I've said it before, but he's got a genuine relationship with the king. And I think that has been used to full potential. And he's obviously liked and respected around Europe. And to be fair, I think Rishi Sunak had begun to rebuild relationships in a way, and then, of course, blew it by leaving the D-Day celebrations. But this won't have done Starmer any harm, but only for the time being.
Well, yes. I mean, if this coalition of the winning doesn't come together, I mean, the Norwegian Prime Minister or Defence Minister was interviewed yesterday and didn't give a wholehearted commitment to sending Norwegian troops as any part of this. So I don't know, how substantial this coalition of the willing. We're still waiting for details of this, and I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, has said it's very important that we quickly and clearly show our unity and response. But the longer it goes on without seeing what input Macron and Starmer actually have to this, what they actually are going to say to Trump, because as we discussed in the first part of the program, some sort of initiative by Europe to Putin, which just won't work. Putin won't talk to anyone without the presence of the United States. So it's crucial that this comes together fairly soon. And if it doesn't, and there are military gains by Russia in Ukraine, then the whole thing could change. I mean, as I've said, to a large extent, and we saw it yesterday, Pat McFadden was put up on one program I saw where he was desperately trying not to criticize Trump, despite everything he said, but on the other hand, be loyal to Europe. One thing that did happen last week, of course, was in an understated but very effective way when Vice President Vance talked about motley collections of countries that hadn't fought wars. Keir Starmer got up in the House of Commons and listed a number of British service people who'd been killed in Afghanistan and Iraq. So Starmer is sending out, which I think is important, even to Trump, a message that there is a line that even he will not allow to be crossed, that he's not an absolute patsy for everything that Trump wants to do. It's a very delicate line he's negotiating, isn't it?
Yes, and I think he's doing it very well. And I think what's very interesting is that he seems to have literally found a different backbone. His posture has changed. He is standing up straighter. He's not looking apologetic. And if we can put to one side the sycophancy and the, as you marvellously said, so he was giving a book token to somebody who'd passed their cycling proficiency test in the White House, he's actually played a blinder. And of course, it is very difficult. Angela Rayner was on the broadcast rounds last week, and I'm sure you wouldn't have to look very hard to find out what she really thinks about Trump. but she was very diplomatic. Pat McFadden yesterday, John Healey, who of course has been out talking to his American counterpart. So everybody is sticking to the line, really. Nobody is going to upset Trump, but they are quite willing to come back and push back on things where there's an inaccuracy or a slight, as it was with J.D. Vance and the, some random countries that haven't fought a war in the last 30 years. So there's all of that. The other thing that's quite interesting is that I think one of these isms that comes up every now and again is patriotism. And the way that, Kerry Badenoch and Robert Jenrick were so quick to follow the Trump line once he was elected, at the expense of and criticize their own country and not standing up for Britain and British values and all the rest of it and not correcting the nonsense that was coming out of Musk and Trump and his acolytes. And I think what Keir Starmer has done has rekindled, if you like, a sense of pride and a sense of we have got a role to play. We can do something, but you're absolutely right, Jim. What can happen? Now, Europe has moved quite quickly to change its own fiscal rules so it can access money, emergency money for defence spending. That's a good thing, and that's happened quite quickly. The other thing they can do, and I think they're certainly considering it, is to use the Russian assets that have been seized and frozen. Many of those are sitting in Belgium. I know we're separately looking at things like the proceeds of the sale of Chelsea Football Club and all of those things. And I would suggest that one of the ways you do it is you get all of that money and you basically say to the Russians, okay, come and get it then. Let's get shot of them. We've only had the court case last week of a honey trap in Great Yarmouth, I think, or something like that. Guest house, a seaside guest house, which was a Bulgarian spy racket working for the Russians, with a journalist targeted, for death. And that's here, that is on British soil. So there's an awful lot at stake. And I don't see that, we are going to be able to pull together a European army anytime soon. I still think most of this is going to come about through diplomatic pressure. But until somebody can say to Trump, you are going to be the loser in this, we haven't got a lot to play with. All we've got a lot to work on is protecting Europe and supporting Ukraine.
Now, obviously, there is a price to pay for the increased defence expenditure to which Sir Keir Starmer and indeed the Chancellor have committed themselves. And we have got this spring statement coming up shortly. The British people generally, I think it's 80% support Ukraine and want to see Ukraine independence. But how are they going to react to the financial implications for the budget, for the spring statement from that? Because I can't see that there isn't going to be more pain on what was already a very tight situation. We're seeing the government looking around for various things that they can do. And one of them is, of course, the ballooning welfare budget. And, Pat McFadden yesterday said, we're Labour, we want to get people back to work and people want to get back to work. But it comes back to what we were talking about last week. In order to increase the strength of the British Army, we've got to have awkward conversations with people who say they're mentally fragile about getting back to work. I'm sorry to sort of simplify it in that way and put two things together like that, but I'm trying to encapsulate the dilemma that the Chancellor's now facing, because it was already a very tight financial situation. And with this increasing defence, I think it's 2.5%, but as I think it's going to have to go to 3-4%. There are massive implications for the British economy, which sadly is weak at the moment. Partly because of Brexit and everything else, but it is weak, and so it's going to be a very difficult few weeks for Rachel.
Well, it's going to be difficult, and it would have been difficult for her regardless of having to increase defence spending as prematurely, if you like. And we know that they inherited it, and we know that the Tories made a complete balls up over 14 years, and we know that Brexit was a total disaster, and we don't need to hear those again. But you're absolutely right, Jim. There will be people going, it's ridiculous. They can find money to send to Ukraine, but I can't get a doctor's appointment, send my kids to school, get a free bus pass, whatever it is. So there is that. But you see, I think it comes again to communications. what the government needs to do now is to stop talking about growth and talk about resilience. And that will cover everything. We have got to be resilient. Europe has got to be resilient. And that means security, in terms of defense, in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of borders, which brings in the whole thing of immigration. It's also about food security. It's about energy security. And it's about a resilient nation. Well, a resilient nation isn't one that's, sitting at home just taking benefits. And I think, the government is seriously going to have to look at the triple lock on pensions. I don't think that's sustainable. We've heard Pat McFadden yesterday and over the weekend talking about cuts to civil servants, so the civil service. And we know that the civil service has ballooned over the last umpteen years. And we know also that, you can get paid quite well and have a comfortable life for legalized loafing. And every government has said they're going to do it. Going back to David Cameron, and nobody's.
Never feel like hearing a Liberal Democrat use the words legalised loafing, but carry on.
No, but we know perfectly well there are people who don't get on, and the more people you have and the less urgency there is, the more things get kicked into the long grass. We'll have another report, we'll have another committee meeting, we'll have another meeting instead of actually, you know what, the bins haven't been emptied, get out and empty the bloody bins. You don't need to sit around and have a report about the what's it called, the rational and intelligent deployment of refuse and environmental services. That's what they do. And I do actually know somebody who wrote that report. I said, "Do you talk about rubbish collection?" He said, "Oh yeah." I said, "Well, then just say so." But so there are a whole load of things, and the big problem, of course, is the number of young people who are not in education, training, or employment, because it's a habit. If you're not in the habit of going to work, it's very hard to get into the habit, and you become less and less employable. And you sort of think, okay, we want to do all this building. Well, we've got a huge shortage of bricklayers. Well, then get some blooming bricklaying courses up and running. Universities, you're all moaning about you haven't got enough money, you've lost all the foreign students. Right, well, get rid of the art history and all of those sort of things, and let's get some bricklayers and some electricians and some carpenters and some plumbers, even if it's only for a couple of years, to make us more resilient. Because those sort of things, but that does require imagination, which I don't think this government has got.
The television event of the week is going to be on GB News tomorrow evening when Jo Phillips goes up against Nigel Farage, who's had a little local difficulty. If you've been living under a stone, just to remind you that the events of last week, on Thursday, Rupert Lowe, who's the Reform MP for Great Yarmouth.
Yes, well, I did, as I said it, I thought, oh, hang on a minute. I didn't want to go down that route.
No, they're absolutely not. Rupert, a loyal patriot, but it's odd that the East Anglian resort is in the news twice this week with the spying thing as well. But anyway, Rupert Lowe, he gave an interview to the Daily Mail where he more or less said that Nigel Farage was the sort of dictator of his party, and that there weren't any real policy directions and it wasn't being run professionally enough. And the very next day, complaints of bullying were referred to the police by the Reform UK party hierarchy, and some more cynical political commentators than myself have suggested that the two events were put together. Anyway, it's led to a rat-a-tat-tat back and forth between Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage. So where stands the Reform UK party today, Jo?
Well, goes back to that thing, a week's a long time in politics. They were riding high, just pipping Labour on all the opinion polls. I mean, forget the Tories because they're not anywhere nobody particularly wants to hear from them. And I think, their membership was growing, money was pouring in, they're getting an awful lot of media coverage. But then I think a couple of things happened. I think the way Trump has behaved has not endeared him and America to the British public, and particularly the way he behaved towards Zelensky in the Oval Office. So I think anyone who sort of stood up there and said, I think this guy's absolutely great and, Elon Musk's wonderful and blah, 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 suddenly looks a little bit out of kilter with the general public. And we also have that rather bizarre interjection from Musk a few weeks back now, where he said he didn't think Nigel Farage was fit to run reform, but he thought Rupert Lowe, who, as far as I know, has never met, but he thought he would be a good bloke. Well, presumably Rupert Lowe obviously believed that and thought, well, I could do this, and has turned on Farage. Now, back in the day when I was working for Paddy, the Liberal Democrats had only got a handful of MPs, and there was, there are similarities, Jim, if you like. Small party, small parliamentary representation, charismatic, well-known, good communicator as their leader. All of a sudden, other people go, well, hang on, I could be the leader. And you have to say to people, but you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for this person. And we were always dealing with the accusations that it was a one-man band. And I think to a certain extent, that's where reform is now. There is no doubt that they wouldn't have got where they are today without Farage. And I think, you don't lead from the middle. I think Tony Blair had it to a certain extent. What I'm quite surprised about is that they're doing this so publicly, which I thought Nigel was a bit more canny than that in a way. That actually you can have these conversations, you have them behind closed doors, you let Rupert Lowe say what he wants to say. But the fact that his KC has had to step in and say, what he said, I said, was total cobblers, has slightly, shot him below the waterline, I think, as far as credibility is concerned.
Yeah, and what struck me yesterday, Richard Tice appeared on the political programmes and was very uncomfortable under questioning about the undeniability, I would have thought, that the reference to the police literally came the day after the criticisms that Rupert Lowe had made of Nigel Farage. I mean, it seems undoubtedly that the two things were connected. And the problem with that is that Reform UK, which is this new party, is going to do things differently and everything else, immediately gets into the sort of dissembling stuff that the old political parties have had to deal with all the years.
Yeah, and as we know, the public do not like disunited parties. They don't like to see internal squabbling. It's what it did for the Tory party for the last 20 years, really. And it will do for reform. But, I'm sure they will sort it out and I'm sure it will go away. But it's interesting. I mean, I think it is just an indication of, a couple of weeks ago, Keir Starmer was really down, reform were riding high. The only thing that's remained constant is that Kemi Badenoch's still useless.
Just one last thing on Reform UK. I mean, we have seen in the past, and on the left and on the right, small parties can completely implode with infighting and just disappear off the face of the earth. So what is our assessment as far as we can do it about reform? I mean, is this just a temporary phenomenon? Because in many ways they are catching the spirit of the public who do want something done about immigration, who are cynical about the conventional political parties. So none of that's gone away. Is this therefore a temporary thing that reform will get over? Or are we seeing the fracturing? I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that Rupert Lowe will go off and form a Reform UK 2025 party.
Honestly, it's like follow your boy band, isn't it? I think most people actually, they want somebody different, that, reform resonates for all the reasons that we all know. They're not particularly interested in the internal machinations of party politics or party structure or anything. And you really only get involved in that, at a point where you become an officer of the party, whether at constituency or branch level. So I don't think it's going to bother the public that much, other than people will go, oh, they're just the same as the others. They're, fighting like rats in a sack. And there will be people who will say, well, I never trusted that XYZ, Farage, stroke Lowe, stroke Tice, whatever. And I think it rather diminishes them in being taken seriously when we are living under the cloud of such incredibly serious national and international events.
Well, we'll soon have an electoral test. I mean, I should say, in all fairness, that a Conservative spokesperson I saw at the weekend said in council by-elections since July, they had well outperformed Reform UK. But of course, we have got these county council elections coming up in May. And I imagine this week the Speaker will trigger the recall petition for the Frodsham by-election. And we'll see if the signatures are gathered, because obviously Reform UK fancied their chances before the events of last week. So we'll see what happens there. And now we're nearly out of time, but just as a sort of light-hearted finale, and to Frank's relief, we're not going to discuss bright car headlights, which he felt was not appropriate for discussion on this program. But we do want to say a word about a film which you'll have to hurry to see, called September 5, that Joe and I have both seen and enjoyed. It's about the tragic events that happened at the 1972 Olympic Games when Israeli athletes were taken hostage and eventually killed. But it all focuses on what happened in the television studios, where there were no real news people very much, although I think there was one who worked on it who's an acquaintance of Joe, which we'll talk about. And so these sports journalists had to deal with this. But it's just fascinating with the sort of primitive technology of 1972, developing film, video cassettes, and all this sort of stuff. And I think we would urge people to try and catch it, Joe. It hasn't done very well at the box office, and you have to seek it out. But just a brief word on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a niche film, and it is for, people like you and I, Jimmy, who've spent our entire life in broadcasting, and we have seen the changes from those ginormous reels of film where you had to mark it with China glove to wind it back so that it was, once it started going, and to do something replay, you physically had to rewind it by hand. So it's a fascinating insight. You can almost feel the claustrophobia in the control room. There's only one person that speaks German, and this fantastically unfolding horror within the Olympic Village, which some people will remember. They'll remember from other films like Munich, made by Steven Spielberg. But it's very clever, I think, to concentrate on it from the image of this newsroom, who were there to cover sport. They've got Peter Jennings, the veteran war correspondent and ABC anchor, who I knew when he was based in London as their bureau chief. A brilliant broadcaster. And they're winging it, but they are broadcasting live. It is the first ever live news event, and it was watched by 900 million people. Including,
of course, the terrorists, because there's that moment of say, gosh, they could be watching this, and they zeroed in on where the terrorists were actually holed up, and they could see themselves being filmed, so the terrorists knew what was happening. I mean, what struck me was that, it was relatively speaking in the early days of terrorism, we were very naive, and when the way the German police handled it and all that sort of thing, there were so many journalists around, and the guy managed to get through with taping rolls of film to his chest and all that sort of stuff. But so the security was, we were in the early days of this. I mean, it was very interesting.
Yeah, and the other thing was, I mean, the big questions, the big philosophical questions, which are always, constant when you think about the recent BBC Hamas documentary. So the question about, what do we call these people? Do we call them terrorists? And Peter Jennings is saying, no, we should call them guerrilla warfare operatives or something. And then the real questions about, if we go live, what happens? Are we going to show somebody being shot dead live on television? Their family are going to see it. So, but you're having to make those decisions in a split second and keep on air. Meanwhile, there's the volleyball and the boxing still going on.
It was about 12 hours before they stopped the games going on, and people just nearby just continuing to sort of have tea in the athletes' village as if nothing was going on.
Well, as we're becoming the alternative to film programs, I will just also, another niche films I would recommend, and it's called Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat. Right. And in the 1960s, America, the CIA sent over black musicians to Africa to try and bring down a coup d'etat in the Congo. And as we know, that ended very sadly with the assassination of Patrick Lumumba. But it's wonderful music, absolutely amazing original footage, and no commentary. It's just pulled together. Lovely for afternoons like us.
Before we incur Frank's wrath, we better wind this up. And so thanks to our producer, Chris Wilcox, who was involved in the work for the wonderful Business Awards last Friday, along with Alice Evans and Beth McKenna, who herself got an award the previous night. So it was a fabulous event. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Joe. We'll look forward to GB News tomorrow night and to the return of Frank McKenna next week. But for now, goodbye.